Hello, this is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad, and in our modules on posthumanism, while tracing the genealogies of the school of thought that we now have identified as posthumanist, we have encountered several subdomains, and the environment has been a principal one, alongside looking at, say, things like new materialisms, feminist critiques of science and technology, in the influence and role played by disability studies, animal studies, plant studies. We have seen intersections of posthumanist thought with environmentalist ideas, particularly in the rise of subdisciplines, shall we say, of the blue humanities and others. We have also seen how concepts like transcorporeality or companion species have been influencing the way in which we think about the human. And the consequences have been varied, as we know. And the literature that has emerged in the wake of many of these ideas about the Anthropocene, about companion species, about transcorporeality, that literature has also been varied. But what is important to recognize is that these are not watertight compartments. Posthumanist thought or posthumanism, especially in the critical posthumanist version, is not a specifically watertight, self-contained school of thought. It adapts from many schools of thought, philosophical positions, political and other activist writings, in order to think through ideas about the human. So, as we have seen when we were tracing the genealogy of posthumanism, critical race theory and postcolonialism, of course, as part of that, feminism, have contributed to how posthumanists have evolved. In looking at techniques and technologies of, say, artificial reproductive technologies, genetic and biotech engineering, posthumanists have seen what it can mean as potential for the critique of humanism, but also the critique of technological driven, pharmacological intervention driven transhumanists. So obviously the range of influences is very large. The types and degrees of influences are huge in number. For us, in this particular module, we are interested in how environmentalism and posthumanism come together. So, for posthumanists, the Anthropocene is the direct result of what they think and argue as anthropocentrism and humanistic or humanist supremacy. The Anthropocene, as you know, and this is a concept that the international community of literary, cultural, philosophical scholars have accepted, but in March 2024 has been rejected by the scientific community. The Anthropocene is a concept that proposes a new era for the Earth, like the Triassic and the Cenozoic and other eras. People have proposed, and it was proposed by chemist Paul Crutzen, who was a Nobel laureate. The Anthropocene is an era marked by human interventions into the planet. Okay, so like the Holocene, the Anthropocene is a major theoretical construction which says, let's measure the Earth's durability, its history, its current status in terms of what the humans have done to it. And this is the direct result, they say, the Anthropocene is the direct result of how we have assumed that humans are central to the planet, that humans occupy the top of the hierarchy when it comes to life forms. So both anthropocentrism and the idea or ideal of humanist supremacy are seen as the key problem that generates this Anthropocene. Anthropocentrism and humanist supremacy includes, one, a sense that the Earth or the planet is meant primarily for humans. And you may recall at this point that we have touched upon this in different ways when you looked at animal studies and plant studies, that the humans have always had an instrumental view of the planet, that the planet, the occupants, the life forms, and the non living exist to serve the humans. So, for many posthumanists, this has been a key problem, that we have assumed that the planet exists for our purposes, for our utilization. And the second is that the human being centers the world. That the human being, like I said a few minutes ago, is the hierarchic superior of all other and to all other life forms. This, the posthumanists and the Anthropocene experts argue, is a key problem. But beyond this, posthumanism also notes that the Anthropocene crisis, which includes the climate crisis, can never be delinked from human practices or human belief systems, of which they list the following as the principal culprits. Extractivism. Extractivism, of course, is the extraction of fossil fuels, natural resources from the Earth's soil and other zones. Colonialism, slavery, monotheism, and capitalism. Self-explanatory concepts, right? So for posthumanists, the problem has been not just the instrumental use of the earth, but the specific kinds of usage to which we have put the earth. That means, for example, this unending exploitation of the earth's resources, with never a thought that perhaps we are overdoing it, that we are taking more than what we need, and that we are taking without ever asking, how does this resource get replenished? How does this resource get compensated for? That you keep drawing and drawing upon the earth. At some point, it will run out, and then what happens? So the emphasis that you see today in engineering and ethical debates about environment and environment protection and conservation, about the careful use of resources, about conservation and the search for alternative fuels, stems from a rather late recognition that we have done this for millennia. We have done this across the world. And that has been the principal problem for humans. But having said that, it is something that applies to all parts of the world. There is a distinction to be made, that extractivism and colonialism have gone together in adversely impacting the global south, or what we can think of as the formerly colonized nations. That the history of the planet has much to do with the history of colonial domination. And in the colonial eras, South America, Africa, Asia, and several parts of the world have been controlled for their natural resources by the European colonial empires. This applies, as many people have argued, in the case of the New World, as it was called, the Americas, in the sense that the extractivist, instrumentalist view of the white man's arrival, which results in what is called settler colonialism, has adversely impacted the environment of the indigenous people. This applies to America, this applies to Australia, and this applies to Canada as well, where, for instance, the white man's modernity, and modernity will go into quotes for obvious reasons, the white man's modernity has hinged upon a very clear extractivist philosophy, a very instrumental view of the earth, irrespective of what the indigenous people who are native dwellers in that region have felt about it, have articulated about it. Which is to say that in all these parameters that we are looking at, extraction of fossil fuels, the encroachment upon the natural habitat of the animals, the overuse of plants, the slavery to which the native indigenous people were subject to, are not separable. As in, you cannot think of environmental injustice of the kind we have just spoken about as separate from social injustice. So the exploitation of the resources and the exploitation of the human being goes together. You cannot say that one happens independent of the other. So for posthumanists, this is an important point, because it shows that the history of humanity on the planet has been the history of subjugation of the environment, of the animal and plant species, of the non-living and other humans. So it's a continuum. Okay. The posthumanist stance on connectedness, on relationality and multi-species belonging, which we have talked about in some detail before, ensures that we decenter the human. And this is a response to the environmental crisis, that we recognize, we acknowledge that the environmental crisis is a result of what I've just said, is the instrumental view of the planet, the idea that the human exists as the supreme monarch of the planet, the idea that the planet and its other life forms are all meant to serve the human. So this idea that posthumanists have forwarded, that we are all connected, that identity is relational, and that it's a question of multi-species belonging rather than hierarchy, has been a response, or must be treated as a response to the environmental crisis. Let's go into a little more detail here. How does posthumanism respond to the environmental crisis? Okay, so let's take a look at some of these things we have rehearsed before. Some of these things we have visited in some detail before. So you might detect the overlaps with what we have said and done in the last few weeks. But so posthumanist response to the environmental crisis comes from a call to recognize, to acknowledge new ways of thinking about the human and new ways of thinking about the planet. Which means, first, an ethical response to the earth and all species, but also towards the non-living forms. An ethical response to the earth and all the species therein and the non-living. This is what the posthumanists, following the work of Donna Haraway and Rosi Braidotti and others, call responsibility. So it's not just a question of responsibility, it's a question of a responsible response, which is why the play on the word responsibility. So it's a response hyphen ability. So you respond in certain ways, you respond in responsible ways. So this, for the posthumanist, is a new way of looking at, of thinking about the human and the planet. Then the second response is to think of new ways of imagining the world. You start thinking about the lives of other species, their role in our lives as in human lives, especially in genres such as ecological writings, nature writing, and science fiction. The point they make, and you will see brilliant work on this in the writings of Ursula Hayes, Tom Von Durin, Deborah Bird-Rose, and others, working at the intersection of posthumanism and environmental studies. Literature is a way of imagining a new world. So literature is not driven by the compulsion to describe the world as it is, but to hypothesize as the world could be. That's the big difference. So you imagine an alternative world. You imagine a different planet. You imagine a different way of humans living their lives. Which is to say that literature provides us with a different vision altogether. Literature provides us ways of imagining other worlds. And that's why for people working in extinction studies, people working on environmental crisis literature, people working on social and environmental justice themes, pay so much attention to literary representations. Because their point is, Science describes the world as it is and offers explanations. Literature, besides doing this, also tells us, well, the world could be different. The world could be of a different form and shape and nature. The third approach after the ethical and the imagining in literature is to recognize that human subjectivity is intersubjective, is the mixture of, is a result of a conjunction of the human and the non-human. Okay? Fourth, posthumanists believe that the retrieval of alternative knowledge systems, which includes, of course, indigenous knowledge, will help decenter Western pedagogy and Western belief systems. They argue that indigenous worldviews, indigenous views of the planet, are of an entirely different order, and perhaps it's time to retrieve those rather than go with the exploitative, extractive Western approaches. By Western, they mean Euro-American approaches. There are problems with this, shall we say, nativist turn about which argues that everything about the native and the local is wonderful and the golden age of that particular pre-colonial past and things like that. But be that as it may, it is an alternative vision. And if you look at the poetry from the Global South, the fiction from the Global South, the indigenous writings, they do recommend, they do document an entirely different approach to the natural world, the approach to the non-living as well. So for many people, this is a very important move. Posthumanists also call for modifying the legal apparatus to include the other than and the more than human. It calls for rethinking the planet and the earth in terms of sustainability, biodiversity, and linkages. It calls for stringent action on practices such as waste dumping, which we know is a particularly serious problem for the Global South. It acknowledges that there is an other than human agency, that the non-human also possesses agency, capacity, and will. Then it makes a great deal of effort to point to the links between patriarchy, that is gender oppression, class, race, and technoscience. And they argue that patriarchy, race, and technoscience have all come together to produce a class of experts, scientists, which have contributed to the Anthropocene crisis. Now, one response or one set of responses to the crisis of posthumanism or the crisis of the Anthropocene and the posthumanist approach to it is emergent in art. We have done some work in the previous modules on bio art and things like that, and I want to dwell a little more on this. Bioart, as we know, is a posthumanist response to the commodification of nature, right? On the commodification of nature. And in the case of bioart, it draws attention to the unevenness of technology, the dominance of technology, and what it does in terms of impact on nature, on other creatures, and other life forms. I do not want to return to questions of bioart, which has already been discussed. But what you need to note is that the rise of bioart brings together science and nature. Okay, brings together science and nature. And the effort is to point out that the organic form that we are interested in, the organic materials with which we work, is actually the result of considerable periods of evolution, the role of other species that have been incorporated into our bodies, and that in all cases, questions of other species becoming ourselves is a crucial one. We have, as you know, looked at other bio-art forms as well. So like I said, I do not want to dwell upon that. But if you look at projects, posthumanism inspired projects which have looked at, say, the Anthropocene, like Bauman Lehigh's Microbiocene, Vanderlist's and others, Funky, which is fungal supercoring, and Cecil Meriton and others in Becoming a Sentinel Species, which has been already discussed in an earlier module. So Microbiocene uses microscopic algae to make the point that microbial monuments and sculptures are an attempt to retell the story of Earth's history from a microbial perspective. Funky, which is fungal supercoating, looks at fungi, obviously from the title, and it talks about biological coating to protect biomaterials. And it illustrates the possibility of living matter in an approachable way. What do bioartists hope to demonstrate? What is the purpose of bioart? Okay, so think a little bit about that. It points to the fact that the so-called human uniqueness, human singularity, is actually not singular, is actually a conglomerate, or to use a favorite posthumanist term, an assemblage of various elements from the environment, which means that we need to start thinking of the human form, of the human body as such, as a certain assemblage depending upon other forms. In all these cases, the emphasis is, as you can see, on the linkage of the humans with other life forms, which, like I began today, is a twist in the tale of humans as hierarchic superiors. It shows very clearly that humans are not inherently superior. Humans are what they are because they have co-evolved with other species. And bioart is a way of reimagining that. Remember what we have said in our list of things that posthumanists use as responses to the Anthropocene crisis, that in literature you imagine the world in a different way, right? So does bioart. Bioart also focuses on rethinking, a reimagining of the human's relationship with the environment. And as you can see, and if you go back to your week 5 module on bioart, experiments and artworks which have been executed by and through a collaboration of artists with scientists and biologists and medical doctors, point to humans as sentinel species, humans as possibly affected by plastics in their blood, which is, of course, the artwork Becoming a Sentinel Species. And drawing attention to the fact that these plastics come from the ocean, these plastics enter into the bodies of non-human animals and the human as well. So the whole idea that some creatures are not affected is not true. All of us are affected to differential but similar degrees. Bioart points to this. So bioart is a very important post-humanist response to the Anthropocene crisis, drawing attention constantly to the fact that we are assemblages, we are relational, we are connected. The toxins that enter the planet in some form will get into us. If a toxin gets into us, it gets into other species as well. It gets into the soil and the non-living as well. So post-humanist responses to the Anthropocene have been varied, and particularly in the domain of literature, philosophy, and art. Thank you.